Welcome to ENG 328, Study Session 1. Modern African Poetry, Origin and Scope. Introduction. In this study session, you will learn about the necessary background to the origin, scope, and classification of modern African poetry. Specifically, you will be exposed to some of the pioneers and their major themes. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to identify the pioneers of modern African poetry, highlight major thematic concerns of the poems of the pioneers. Pioneers of African poetry. Historically, it is possible to trace the beginning of African poetry in the European languages, not in African itself, but among African exiles in Europe and ex-slaves of the New World. As a result, African writing in European languages betrays its deepest characteristics. First, alienation from African soil, both physically and psychologically. Second, a consciousness, even though sometimes agonizingly suppressed, of politics as the conditions of its operation, while those writers and poets who would carry out the task of defending African interests, and those who, for whatever reason of convenience or necessity, were content to hide behind a mask of a newly assumed culture. 1981, Ditto 108. Notably, among the exiles, the various forms and degrees of this bondage had some consequences. After being taken into captivity, some slaves were taught to read and write. As a result, some of them ventured into the art of music, painting, and literature. Works of African exiles and ex-slaves such as Olaudah Equiano, Ignatius Sancho, Otala Cugoano, and others. There were also reports that individual African wrote verse in both classical and modern European languages, which was of more than passing interest. Importantly, some of these early poets, for example, thematically dwell on Christianity and God, and poets like H.I.E. Dlomo from South Africa dwells on the theme of protest, religion, Christianity. The Zulu Isibongo praise poetry. The pioneer poets saw the function of poetry as one of the public posturing. They see the role of a poet as that of a converter. Most of them were not poets with individual voice, but versifiers and echoes of what the public approved. The tribal border widened to accommodate Christianity and elite. Thematic concerns. Naturally, a tension is aroused in their works, a yearning towards the life of the soil, innocence, and westernization, corruption. They wrote about race, politics, or God, or curiously poetic in an elite 19th century way poems on death, love, sunrise, sunset. However, with the Second World War came poems pledging unstinted support to Britain. R.E.G. Amato, European man. Consuming love for Africa, Amato and his contemporaries saw themselves as committed to express their views individually. Most were concerned with what they wrote, few with how they said it. In The Lonely Soul, Amato expresses disgust and disenchantment, which is characteristics of the pioneer poets. I met an old woman, talking by herself, down a lonely road. A man talks to himself. If showers of sorrows fall down like arrows, the love wayfarer. As earlier noted, most of the poets in this category were not committed to style. They merely wrote to convey their messages. How they said what they needed to say does not bother them. In Between the Forest and the Sea, Amato claims that African poet must be familiar with his past and express that past in authentic and unmistakably accents without a conscious appeal in any racial context. In his second volume, Deep Down the Black Man's Mind, Our God is Black, the Human Race. Most of his poetry are dominated with the issue of race. Some of his personal poems are sad and sentimental. Dennis Osadibe, conflicting attitudes. Unlike Amato, Osadibe does not walk through the medium of the individual to voice a public statement. As earlier noted, this group of poets set the stage for the others that came after them. They were mostly people who had received British education in England, who were attracted to Western culture and civilization and became fervent adherents of the English poet tradition. Most of the poems they composed were fashioned after the Old English Christian hymnal style, with many of their poems written in quatrains or quasi-sonnet form, according to Babatunde Omobowale. This reliance on Western literacy traditions was not peculiar to Anglophone West African poetry alone. It was everywhere on the continent. 1997, Ditto 130. The pioneers blossomed between the early 20th century and 1960s. In their formative years, there was a conflict among the pioneers as a handful of them, regardless of their intellectual background, that it was necessary for them to infuse aspects of their tradition and culture into their poetry to illustrate whatever they were saying. According to Omobowale, we find that despite the large number of poems and vastness in cultures and languages, Anglophone West African poetry has always been indivisible spring of similar poetic expression since the days of the pioneers. 1997, Ditto 130. This indivisible chord becomes more conspicuous because of the general African belief in the existence of the world of the supernatural that wields domineering influence on the lives of mortals. This is reflected in the poem of Michael Dehi, Anang, Let's Live in Peace. In frailty upon the earth, whereon they rot, and we, in full disintegration, will be identified with dust. 1977, Ditto 13. Another important aspect of the pioneer poetry is the belief in supernatural. This is well represented in the poetry of Dennis Osadebe, O mortal man, and know that since this world began, men and stars have fallen low. 1977, Ditto 14. Osadebe, aside his commitment to Africa and hymnal style, for which he was known, he was well versed for his realistic rendering of Igbo oral tradition and folk tales in English. Thus, most of his poems draw their inspiration from the cultural heritage of his people, the Igbo. However, with a poet like Gladys Castley Hayford of Ghana, the idea of the supreme being or supernatural is symbolized by the Christian God. Our poem, Rejoice, is largely informed by a Western and religious background. If God has been so gracious as to make you black or brown, for you are a great nation. 1977, Ditto 14. Almost all the pioneer poets have been influenced by Christian religion, and we have some of the biblical themes reflected in their works. At its early stage, The poetry of the pioneers was quite distinctive due to the very simple style and language that the poets used. Their works was devoid of complex images and diction. As earlier posited, their themes revolved around nature, love, beauty, philosophy, homeland, and of course, the supernatural. At the earliest stage of the Anglophone West African poetry, issues like emancipation and freedom of the black race from the shackles of colonialism, notably apartheid and civil war, were not really the concern of the pioneers. Their poems were also devoid of humor. Omobowale, 1997-132. According to Louis Nkosi, 1981, later on the attitude of the pioneer poets changed from moralization to public. Despite their acquired education from British colonialists, felt the need to uplift their people to the art of poetry. According to Omobowale, this was a new commitment to ensure the development of the black race. 1997-132. Most of the poetic output of Michael Dehi Hanang of Ghana became very revolutionary and nationalistic, as exemplified in the thematic focus of the poetry. Coupled with a sense of pride in their color, they saw that the advancement of the black race could only come if the foreign civilization accommodated them, the blacks. This, however, did not stop them from eulogizing Africa and re-echoing the right of the Africans' self-determination. Poems like Dei Anag's Their Africa and Dennis Osadebi's A Young African Plea are ardent examples which show the pioneers' new trust and concern about the fate of Africa and Africans. Below are a few lines from Dei Anag's poem, Awake, thou sleeping heart, awake and kiss the love-lorn brow of the Eblon lass. Louis Nkosi also identifies an ambiguity text, Tasks and Marks, 1981. He believes that the ambiguity has resulted from the conflict of the poets' cultural background and their British education upbringing. He points out that this ambiguity acquired its most authentic articulation in the successful fusion of African and European images contained in the poetry which came to be written by the writers of the next generation, 1981-124. Before we round up this study session, it is important to note the exclusion of North African poetry. This raises a very fundamental question about criteria for inclusion and exclusion of what modern African poetry is. The reason might be adduced by teachers of African poetry on grounds of race, language, and religion. This is informed by the fact that most of the poetry written by poets of this region is in Arabic and is about Islamic and Arabic themes and experiences. In other words, North African poets are not black Africans, but largely of mixed Caucasians. The truth, however, is that not much has been done by scholars to make the poetry of the region generally accessible to the other regions. According to Ichemowa, if this region is part of Africa, it will be impossible not to have poetry that deal with the sociological as well as of the Africanese of its people. 1997-116. One might say the needed requisite is the translation of the works composed in Arabic into English and French. If this is so, as suspected in some quarters, it follows therefore that the problem of language indigenous is the same for all the regions of Africa. North African poetry, because of the region's multi-experience of Arabic, European, Islamic, and Christianity colonialism, is characteristically defined by moral and political themes. We have poets like Hamad Shakwi, Al-Farajri, Muhammad al-Banidi of Egypt, al-Baji, al-Masudi of Tunisia have clearly depicted moral and religious structures which serve as masks for more committed aesthetic and social political issues. Study session summary. In this study session, you learned that pioneer poets saw the function of poetry as one of public posturing. They see the role of a poet as that of a converter. Most of them were not poets with individual voice, but versifiers and echoes of what the public approved. Their themes revolved around nature, love, beauty, philosophy, and homeland, and, of course, the supernatural. We have come to the end of study session 1. Thanks for listening.